So let's understand what the difference is between a class variable and an instance variable. They're both attributes that help describe the object. We understand that. But depending on where you declare them, they become either a class variable or the instance variable. A class variable is also called a static variable. Now, you have to understand the word static doesn't mean it doesn't change, like a static IP versus a dynamic IP. But static in object-oriented programming means the variable belongs to the class, not to the object. That means since it belongs to the class, there's only one copy of it. No matter how many objects you create from that class, there's only one class variable, and everybody shares that one value. Now, why would you do that? Well, maybe you wanted a common value every attribute would use, but you don't want to worry about the attribute controlling that instance variable. If the value ever changed, you would have to go and modify the value for every single object. Whereas if it was a class variable, you would only have to update it once, and every variable would automatically have that changed value. So how do we create class variables and instance variables, and how do they really work? Let's create a brand new program, and I'm going to save that file as class instance.py. And in it, what I want to do is I want to go ahead and create the class student that we've been working with. And I want to go ahead and give it a class variable. We'll call it institution. And we're going to go ahead and give it a value. Techies are us university. We now have a class variable. Now, earlier videos, you would have just thought, oh, I have an attribute. And it is an attribute, but it's an attribute that belongs to the class, and it's shared by all the objects. If I wanted to make an instance variable, I would need to define that in the constructor. But for now, let's just create a default constructor. So we'll create the default constructor, and we're not going to do anything. So I'll just say the word pass. And then what I want to do is in the actual program, I want to create a student object, and I'm going to call the default constructor that we just created. And I could have left it off. I could have just done that, and Python would automatically create a constructor. You wouldn't see it, but it would look just like that. But we're going to control our own constructors. So I'll make one object, let's call it OStudent1, and then I'm going to make another one, and I'll call it OStudent2. In fact, in order to match the book, we'll just say OStud1, OStud2. This creates an object of student, stores it to the variable. Creates another object of student, stores it to the variable. They are actually separate objects in memory. They each have their own identity. Let's go ahead though and print off the institution for each of those objects. So we're going to print the student1 object, we'll print the student2 object. Let's save it and let's run it. And we're going to run the Python of class instance.py. And it prints Techies R Us University 2 times. That's great. Works wonderful. Let's try something. Let's say ostud1.institution is equal to East West College. Now remember, we said that institution was a class variable, meaning it's a static variable, and that means that everybody shares the same variable. Everybody. Everybody shares it. No matter how many objects, you share that same one. So OSTUD1 and OSTUD2 should both share that if it's a true static class variable. So let's go ahead and run that and now see what prints. East West College prints on this, and Techies R Us prints there. Now wait a minute. I told you that if you declare an instance variable in the class outside of the constructor, it becomes a class variable and it's a static variable and it's shared by all the other objects. Well, obviously, that might not be accurate because when I said ostud1.institution, it's almost as if it had its own copy of institution. Well, let's try something else. Instead of saying ostud1, let's actually use the class name. So if we said student.institution, now this is weird because we thought you always had to have an object in order to access an attribute. And that's true if the attribute is an instance variable. Well, this is a class variable. And the true definition of the way a class variable works is that it belongs to the class, so you should use the class name to access it. Let's save this, see what happens. Now it prints East West College for both of these. Now this is becoming really strange, isn't it? Because it's almost as if I use an object here, some link between the attribute, the class value, and the object are broke, and it's like it has its own attribute. Meaning, when I said OSTUD1, remember, it printed East West College and Techies R Us. If it was a true class variable, wouldn't both of those objects print East West College? But when I use the word student.institution, it does print East West College. What this really means is we don't even need to create objects if you want to work with a class variable. I could just do this, run that program, and it would work. It'd print East West College because a class variable lives with the class. And as long as you use the class name and the class variable, it works. And everybody shares the value. However, once you assign a value to that institution class variable, through the reference of the object, it's almost as if the system creates this, an attribute called institution. This is now an instance variable. That is a class variable. This belongs to the object. This belongs to the class. And that happened once I said ostud1 dot class variable name. How do we know that's really happening? Well, let's try something else. I'm going to take that line off of there, and let's say ostud2 dot institution is equal to a different name. How about CP University? Or we also call it CPU. And then we want to go ahead and print off the institutions. And let's also print student.institution. So let's see what prints here. It prints East West College, CP University, and Techies R Us, which goes to show that this is the class variable. And by using the class name, everybody has access to the one copy. But once you use that class name with the object, like right here, and assign it a different value, Python seems to create its own instance variable. Anything you define in the constructor is the instance variable. If I did this, I would now have an instance variable tied to the object and a class variable tied to the class, and they would both have the same name. But based upon how I access that variable, it will know whether to go to the instance variable, because it's an object, or the class variable, because it's a class. And that's the main difference between a class variable and an instance variable. And you could define any class variables you want here. We could say self dot first name and give it a value, an empty string. Self dot last name, give it an empty string. Self dot GPA, assign it a 0.0. Of course, we don't need the pass statement anymore because we're actually doing something. But now I could come here and I could say ostud1 dot first name is equal to Mary, and ostud2 dot first name is equal to John, and I could actually print ostud1 dot first name and print ostud2 dot first name, and we could concatenate those with the class variable. First name goes to student dot institution, and we could do the same thing right here. So let's see what that looks like. We print off East West College, CP University, Techies R Us, and then it prints Mary goes to Techies University, John goes to Techies University. And I could have said, but wants, how about, but did go to self dot institution, and we'll do the same thing. Actually, instead of self, we need to say ostud1 because we're not inside of a method. Now let's see what happens, because this is actually saying you don't have that. It says it has no institution. Well, that's because you have to spell your attributes correctly. ostud2. Try that. So let's see if we see the Techies R Us and then a different value for each of those objects. Let's run it one more time. And it says Mary goes to Techies R Us University, but did go to East West College. John goes to Techies R Us University, but did go to CP University. So it's really strange that if you create a class variable, this is a static variable shared by all the objects until you assign a value using the object itself. Then it's as if Python creates an instance variable called institution. You still have the class variable, but then it creates an instance variable for each of the objects. That's something that's very important to understand. And that's the difference of class variables and instance variables.